It was 5 years ago today that Martin Scorsese declared the Marvel movies to not be cinema. So, in honor of this momentous anniversary that has sparked many a debate over the past half decade, which mostly includes people who have never seen Citizen Kane telling people that not every movie has to be Citizen Kane, I decided to mark the subject of today's video. Actually, that was not phrased as well as I'd have liked it to be, but observe the power of the image as it overwhelms any residual mediocrities or flaws in the constraints of language. Even that was phrased badly, but it hardly even matters. At least I think so. I think that the opening 5 minutes of Rear Window have more cinema to them than the entire MCU put together. And this is a little exercise in that. Also, it's raining outside. And Bronzong, the subject of today's video, brings the rain within Pokey lore. So, perfectly fitting. I actually walked back home in the rain, which is why I'm a bit of a mess. I was listening to my 2000s hits. It was an interesting experience. Anyway, the handy-dandy Christmas lights are here to bring a source that is not my repulsive balcony light. Forgive the rough slipshod setup here, but hopefully it will get the job done. And if not, well, it's still cinema, and that's the most important thing. So, I was thinking I don't know why I started thinking about DPP Bronzong the other day. I was just thinking of its development. And also it's cold, which is why I am still dressed up in my outside wear. So, yeah, DPP Zong. I hope the light works with this, by the way. DPP Zong is an interesting, has an interesting trajectory as a Pokemon. I think it's still underrated in some ways, but when DPP started, or when Diamond and Pearl started, it was mostly just like a Stealth Rock lead, like Swampert, except it has Hypnosis, which is 70% accurate in Diamond and Pearl, but it's kind of a generic bulky Pokemon, like Jirachi and Metagross, but with, a lot less offensive power. But hey, it has Levitate, which is crazy. And yeah, Heat Proof, but, it's going to be Levitate. That's a big part of the appeal, with one exception that we'll get to. But then, in Platinum, with Skarmory and Fortress, running around everywhere, everything being so spike-centric, then you kind of ignore Bronzong because it's just such setup fodder. And for the most part, Zong gets relegated to lower levels of usage, lower tier players and teams. People think, oh, it can set dual screens, it gets relegated to setting up rain on rain teams. It is very good at that with Damp Rock, Explosion, but rain teams are, of course, insanely gimmicky. So the one exception, this was a team that was insanely ahead of its time, is Zach 91's Superman stall. For those of you who don't know the term Superman, I have a video called Superman in Advance OU, which goes into detail. But Superman teams have become very popular in other generations as well, in that we realize hazard removal is bad, and it's better to just ignore it. As much as you can, of course. But notice how I said it has become, a very popular style. This, way back in 09, this was not a standard in DPP at all. It was all about, either you kind of grin and bear it with your Skarmory semi-stall stuff, or you try to use Fortress to spin the whole thing away. Like entire teams dedicated to ignoring it. If you had such a team, you probably happened upon it by accident. Zach 91's is the only team I know of from that era that did this very, very consciously. If there's someone else from that era who remembers anything else, I would love to hear more about it. But Zach 91 won a Smogon tour, or a live Smogon tour with this team. and I assume used it in many other places. But it's funny because you look at the 6 Pokemon he used, and you realize, that gets used today with one major exception, and it of course features Bronzong. You think, oh well, Bronzong invites spikers in like the plague, and then you realize, oh, it also ignores spikes. So what if your entire team ignores spikes? And his team was Bronzong, Skarmory, Rotom, whatever, Heat, Wash. It was a Rest Talk Rotom. It wasn't using the signature move, so it doesn't matter. Latios, I believe it was Calm Mind HP Fire, which was a popular finishing set on those kinds of defensive teams. HP Fire for Scizor and Skarmory, and just general good coverage against things like Jirachi and Metagross that are getting weakened by spikes. So yeah, Zong, Skarm, Rotom, Latias, Gliscor. He was famous for his Gliscor because Sandvale was allowed. It was a dark time, and it was called British Gliscor or Britscore because he had a knack for dodging every attack imaginable with it. There was a joke that British Gliscor was the best rapid spin blocker because you're just gonna dodge spin with it. So. Yeah, and then the last Pokemon was Blissey. Now, you notice the first 5 Pokemon are very immune to spikes, and Blissey is not. But it kind of follows a principle that even predates, Advanced Superman, which is that, yes, Blissey gets affected by spikes, but it takes so little damage from everything, and it has immediate recovery, and it also covers so much that it's fine, especially with the rest of your team being as resilient as it is. So, advanced teams will throw Blissey on their Superman stuff now. They didn't at the time. So this was a very original creation that really, drove the metagame. I don't know if it drove the metagame forward. I think it anticipated the metagame much, much later, because again, this is the only team of that time, of its style, that I can remember or that I can find. So he was really ahead of the curve, and I mean, it worked beautifully. So yeah, it was a great team, but that kind of stuff didn't really take off. Now, if we want to fast forward to today, or the past half decade, since Latias was reintroduced, people were also kind of tired of how bad the hazard removal options are. Like, yeah, Starmie is good, Starmie is fine, but you over rely on Starmie. It's the most exploitable thing in the world, which is kind of a familiar pattern with the hazards of it all. That you realize, yeah, the hazard removers are fine, but a hazard stacking team that really doesn't want you to spin will not let you spin. Or they'll let you spin once and then you're gone because of Pursuit Tar. If they let you spin at all. That's kind of the conundrum. But yeah, so you see that team that gets used now, Zong, Skarm, Rotom, Latias, Gliscor, and instead of Blissey, Clefable. So now you have the 6 spike immunes, and you have, less special walling power, but Clefable's still a great special wall. Obviously, this comes with a trade-off. Like something like Specs Kingdra is going to be a lot scarier to that team than it would be to Zach's team. But yeah, the way it anticipated the metagame of, a decade later is kind of funny. Yeah, so going back to 09, 2010, then, Zong at the highest level was generally just getting used like this. So then this... then there's a development, and you think, oh, well, Bronzong's this wall, right? It's utility, Stealth Rock, Hypnosis stops getting used after Platinum because it's now 60% again, which is, for the better. So people think, oh, wall, dual screens, rain dance, whatever. Except for Zach, who used just like I don't even remember what his set was. I'm sure it was just like a generic wall. I'm sure he wasn't blowing up. But people realize, hey, this thing has some great offensive potential. Now you look at that attack stat. I don't even know what the base stat is. I just know it hits 304 with max investment. And, that's not breaking the bank. That's base. What is that? Not even base 90. Yeah, because base 90 would let it hit 306, so it's got to be 89, right? Yeah, so that's not very strong. But it was a player named PTTP. If that sounds awkward, it's because it's an abbreviation for Power to the Pika. And I believe he was the first to use Offensive Trick Room Bronzong, which now is kind of a household name, especially if you play DPP. But the idea of an offensive Trick Roomer didn't really exist before. Now you see it on like Magirna or whatever, but or Reuniclus. But before that, Trick Room was also a gimmick, and of course you'd see Bronzong on it, but that was even gimmickier than Rain. So yeah, you would see Zong being used on these dual screens teams. Sorry, not dual screens. I just was wondering if there's enough battery on this thing. Okay, yeah, no, we're still going. Uh, although I guess that uncertainty should motivate me to move faster, right? Yeah, so Bronzong is getting used on these trick room teams, when they're used, but it's just trick rooming and blowing up. It's not a threat on its own. There was a distinction between trick roomer and a threat, like Rhyperior. And of course, trick room, you don't really see solitary trick room. You just see it as, a whole trick room team, uh, gimmicky as that is. So what PTTP did, he kind of viewed it as, well, I don't know if this is how he saw it, but I basically saw it that way, as a threat in and of itself, kind of like an Agilogros, because, they have the same typing, the same stab, earthquake, boom. But this, with the Zong, the thing is that you can't outspeed it with any Scarfers. That's one thing. And the other thing is that a whole team dedicated to Trick Room, super gimmicky, of course. But with just this one Trick Room Pokemon that uses it as a threat to make itself a threat, use it for itself, then that's fine. And then that way you don't really need to rely on it, but you can. And the pairing that he made very famous, that a lot of other teams borrowed, was Trick Room Bronzong plus Choice Band T-Tar. Because Choice Band T-Tar rips things up, right? But it's slow, obviously. You put it under Trick Room, great. It's a great strategy because with Trick Room Zong, you can either try and sweep something yourself, or you can Trick Room, blow up immediately, and then you have CB Tar in with several turns of Trick Room. Excuse me. So that's fantastic. And as far as Trick Room Zong sweeping on its own, that it does a great job because, yes, it's not that strong, but what it does have is a 150 base power stab in the form of Gyro Ball and minimal speed, with a Macho Brace attached. So, yeah, EQ is just there to get the job done against Steels, Heatran, Jirachi. But with Gyro Ball, then you are really smacking something like a Flygon or a Dragonite, like Pokemon that aren't exactly frail. Obviously it's going to completely smack something like Gengar, but with those medium, bulkier Pokemon, even something like an offensive Shaman is going to take a very, very respectable chunk from it. And obviously you can just blow up on a Suicune or whatever. And what's also nice about this Trick Room Bronzong is that it's an offensive-minded Pokemon that has very, very respectable natural bulk. Especially, so you can use it for all sorts of special attackers, at the time Super Rachi, very popular, just completely run over the standard Thunderbolt HP ground set that became popular after Salamence was banned. And then you have the Gengar, the Gengar checking factor, because subsequent Gengar was just terrorizing everything. So, but the support for not just CBT Tar, but another team was a Lizard Man's team. This was the team that really made things popular. PTTPs, let me see if I can remember it. It was Lead Infernape with Stealth Rock, Zong, Offensive Suicune, Snorlax, I think, which is very unusual, even for the time. I think there was a Breloom. Now I'm starting to lose a little bit. I think there was a Breloom. I forget what else. But I remember a couple years later I played him in a tournament and he used it. So yeah, Infernape, Suicune. I know it had Suicune and Snorlax and Bronzong, but the last two are escaping me. If someone remembers, please let me know. Yeah, but Lizardman's team was made it the Bronzong and the ensuing strategy much more popular because I think it was a little more user friendly. It wasn't demanding Snorlax, which potential for sure, but very tricky to use for your average person. It's kind of like how Heist's teams or Babidi 1998's teams. Same person. He just had a name change because he was going through something back in 2015. He was making a statement. But yeah, his teams were very personalized to his style. And so people would want to copy his teams because he was such a great player. But they were like, dude, this is weird. I can't just autopilot with this. How does this team even work? This team sucks. But he would win with them. So yeah, the Snorlax on PTTP's team was kind of similar. Whereas Lizard Man's was a lot more, friendly to every skill level. And it was a great team. It's still a great team today. You could still use it. It had Metagross, or I think it led off with Life Orb Starmie because that was in vogue at the time. Life Orb Starmie is a great anti-lead, and if you face like a Machamp lead, you just pivot, or like a Roserade, you just pivot into your Lum Metagross and you're fine. So the Lum Metagross setting up rocks, Scarf Rotom, and then the Bronzong, obviously the CB and the mixed Dragonite. And turns out with this, you don't just have one Trick Room abuser. Obviously, the Snorlax on PTTP's team was the other Trick Room abuser, or no, it was the Trick Room abuser because it didn't have a CB. My apologies. So yeah, Lizardman's was the team that popularized the Zong CB combination, which was then used on a lot more. And Mixed Dragonite was also a great partner, because it has a similar thing with CB. I mean, it's faster, but it still gets out. It gets revenge kill by a lot of stuff on offense. So that was his with CB and Mixed Knight. By the way, the big thing is with Trick Room Bronzong obliterates offense, absolutely lights out. Deathly. But with Stall, you are a sitting duck. So with CB and Mixed Dragonite, you don't just have these great Trick Room abusers against offense, but you also have these natural stall crushers, which is beautiful. So you're covered on all fronts. So that's why the team was so great, so successful. And that was Bronzong's new default mode for some time. You would just have the Trick Room Zong plus CB almost always, and the other stuff you could mix and match as much as you liked. But those two were very, very commonly seen together. Yeah, there were a bunch of teams of that period, and for years later, you still see some now. Actually, I think there's a very popular team built by Osgood that has the strategy. Although I don't think it has CB I'm misremembering. I think there's a lot of stuff. You get my point. So for a couple of years, it's just Trick Room Bronzong City. And let me just check on the phone again. Okay, so now the year is 2012. This was the first time I had noticed something that had a sorry, I was just remembering this team McMegan and Ojama used to use. I'm misremembering it, but I remember it had a Trick Room Bronzong, and it also had the Stealth Rocking Celebi and a Specs Kingdra. Yeah, I forget exactly how it went, but I remember I faced McMegan with it in a tournament, and my Subroost Arrow stalled out the Bronzong's Gyro Balls. That was a great match. And then my Spadef Hippowdon stalled out Leaf Storm Celebi, and then survived a Spec Kingdra Surf to win the game. That was Spadef Hippowdon's glory days were really something, let me tell you. Anyway, that team also had a Heatran, I remember. So Celebi, Heatran, Kingdra, Bronzong. Last, I don't quite remember. But yeah. So you see that it was very popular. That was a game from 2012. And I remember Ojama had a game with Spadef Hippowdon also stalling out a Spadef Celebi that against Parangon or TB Raka, and he also had a Bronzong on his team. But I don't think it was the same thing. But point is, you see me remembering all these teams is not just, oh, remember this team? It's just to illustrate more. Yeah, Zong was, now a standard. Because, pre-offensive Trick Room Zong, it's just kind of like this, yeah, it's OU, but it's kind of junk. What does it even do? To now, it's like a real part of the metagame. It's fantastic. Having this offensive threat that does everything it does while also checking things like DD Dragonite is just spectacular. So obviously there's a lot of desire to pair it with Magnezone because oh, well, invite Skarmory. Oh, well, trap Skarmory. And now you're a lot more threatening. Something like CB can also trap a bulky Rotom. So that then your explosion, without Skarmory and Rotom in the picture, your explosion is a lot scarier. So suddenly even Bronzong becomes threatening to stall. It's beautiful stuff. CB and Magnezone were very popular alongside Bronzong. Throwing things like Gengar. I'm describing more teams that are getting used now. You can throw in your DD or CBD Knight, whatever you like. You can. I'll stop myself there. But yeah. So the thing is, next in 2012, I faced Earthworm for this little tournament thing. And he had one of the most unusual teams I've seen. I've mentioned this team before because it was also an early user of Clefable. And this team was unusual in that it was a stall team, but it had no spikes, and but it did have a very heavy emphasis on spikes ignoring. So it was Bronzong, Celebi, Magnezone, Spadef Gliscor of all things. Zong, Celebi, Magnezone, Gliscor, T-Tar. I think it was a T-Tar lead. Yeah, he had a bulky one. and I think Heist had a variant because he and Heist both used it, but Heist had a variant with Scarf. And I forget what the last was. Zong, Celebi, Zone, T-Tar, Gliscor. It'll come back to me, I'm sure. But yeah, it was a Protect Toxic Magnezone, Devil in the set. And that's the thing about this team. Oh, Clefable, obviously. Yeah, Zone, Zong, Celebi, Clefable, T-Tar, Gliscor. Yeah, so very unusual team. And Earthworm and Heist, Earthworm, they were very similar in that they used these teams that were kind of off kilter, and you're like, dude, how does this even work? And for them, it made perfect sense. You would have Spinef Gliscor stalling out Vaporeons and things like that. But yeah, the unusual part is that the Magnezone was Protect Toxic, which was not really seen, and so was the Bronzong. You think of Bronzong before, it's this Pokemon. It doesn't have a lot of staying power, no recovery. Great typing, sure, but it's not doing that much. And then this is like realizing that Protect is kind of busted, and with Protect on Bronzong, you can't scout it with you can't like threaten it out with a choice move and then do something else. It's going to scout that. It finds a very easy method of gaining as much leftovers as it can. So something like Swampert in Advance, or Heatran in many generations, which makes its living by protecting for lefties. Yeah, well, here's something that Spikes immune and Stealth Rock resistant. So incredible longevity. Protect Toxic in the last two moves. Earthquake, of course, and the last one. I mean, a lot of people have used Gyro Ball, adopters of Toxic Protect Bronzong, but I always thought that was a waste. I didn't think you needed it at all. And in fact, the best move for it that Earthworm was using was HP Ice. Now, I had never seen an HP Ice Bronzong before, but it actually kind of became a new standard. You realize, oh, well, its special attack is so weak, but then you're like, actually, you don't need it to be super strong because the point was to take on Gliscor. Because otherwise, Gliscor just shuts you down, and now you switch into that thing. So it's great. Bronzong with this set, with Protect Toxic. Now, that team specifically was very idiosyncratic, so it didn't take off. But the Toxic Protect Bronzong idea definitely did. It started spreading among some players. And now it was just like a thing. But the thing is, it was hard to figure out what kind of team you're supposed to put it on. That part still doesn't make complete sense. But it's being experimented with more. It's very anti-offense, of course. But you got to figure out that the anti-stall part of it is not it on its own, but more it being a part of a team that can last forever. Because if the stall team can KO all the rest of your stuff with passive damage, and then you have the Bronzong left, then you're going to lose. But if you have Bronzong as part of a greater unit that takes on stall teams as passive damage, then you're fine. Yeah, you can just throw it into Skarmory Whirlwind and not really care what happens, even with max hazards. So yeah, this Bronzong set gets used more, and it becomes really appreciated once because it's a wall that doesn't care about Magnezone. And of course, in response, Magnezone eventually has to start running Magnet Rise. But you still have to be careful about switching into that Earthquake. So yeah, Magnet Rise Magnezone becomes the standard pretty much solely for Bronzong. And it has a lot of other moves it can run, so that does not come at no cost. So yeah, Bronzong was very popular when Sub SD Gliscor was popular because the Ice Fang, Sub SD Ice Fang Gliscor with Sand Veil was the issue. And Paralysis and Sand Veil, it was just an ugly, ugly time in the metagame. Thank God we finally kicked Sand Veil out, even though there were some geniuses who were like, you know what, it's completely fair that your HP Ices should actually be as accurate as Stone Edge. Yeah. But yeah, that whole anti-Gliscor, anti-Magnezone thing, that's where that was coming in. And not a lot of people were really willing to use Magnet Rise Zone at the time. So before that really had a chance to take off, Sandvale was gone. Good riddance. But yeah, I mean, you just have this incredible Pokemon that takes on, Flygon, Gengar, Kingdra, Suicune. You just kind of... It's very similar to Heatran, Spinef, Bulky Steel with Protect and Toxic, of course. But it's just tried and true. And that even like a Fire Blast isn't going to take it out. You live a Mixed Knight Fire Blast. You live I mean, if push comes to shove, you even live a Heatran Fire Blast, as long as it's not boosted. So, yeah, great Pokemon. And then it's not a very flashy, but then mostly what happens is people realize the Superman angle, and it settles into that team mentioned earlier. The Zong, the 6 Spikes immune team. A great team has some flaws, mostly Taunt Wisp becoming popular on Gengar, which became popular for Wish Protect Jirachi. But yeah, you've got that. And of course, Trick Room Bronzong continues to be popular. Now, in early 2016, I was messing around with a lead Bronzong that used Heat Proof. This was the exception I was talking about earlier. With Heat Proof and Lumberry, like the idea was basically you have like a poor man's Metagross, but the thing is, it's like a Metagross that can hold Lumberry and Occaberry at the same time, which is very cool. So the Heat Proof acting as your Occaberry, obviously. So you can stand on Heatran, Infernape, whatever, and you have the Lumberry to wake up against Roserade, to absorb a Machamp Dynamic Punch and not be confused, all sorts of stuff. Breloom tries to spore you, you blow it up, things like that. So that was very cool, and it became adopted by a couple other players. It found some use on offense teams. I still think it's a good set. You can use it in the mid game as well. And the alternative to Lumberry is Custap Berry. Yeah, like every night there's a group of Germans that come by and make some noise. I don't know what it is, but anyway, I don't know if this is them or not. But if I were a betting man, I would put my money on it. So yeah, Custap Berry is the other alternative because then it's like a Metagross that runs Occaberry and Custap Berry, and that's obviously great because Bronzong gets knocked down to low health, and then you Custap explode on whatever. Yeah, so that was a great set. It's good in the mid game, obviously, as well. Although once you get to the mid game, I think that's when you want Levitate more, because then you want to switch into Earthquakes. That's a big point of entry. And it's not even about being revealed by spikes or whatever, because that's not always going to be the case. It's just generally easier. In the lead slot, it's a lot more. You can't expect it as much. Yeah. Then the other thing Bronzong can do Trick Iron Ball, which is always underappreciated. I remember I used it on a team I built for August in 2014 alongside Hazards. Like the idea is that you trick the Iron Ball to Skarmory or Rotom, and suddenly they're getting affected by spikes. In the game where it was used, August against Malekith, Rotom switched in after being tricked in Iron Ball and took max spikes and even T spikes. It was a thing of beauty. So there was that, and there was Trick Iron Ball. Can use, but generally Metagross is preferred for that. I personally think this set should take off. I really like Trick Choice Band Bronzong because with Choice Band you have the immediate power to really threaten things. I mean, that Gyro Ball is really smacking things. Earthquake is going to threaten Jirachi a hell of a lot more. Explosion puts a dent even if you boom into a Jirachi, for example. And with Choice Band, you trick something in Iron Ball, yeah, you ruin its function for the most part, but it's still pretty functional usually. But with Choice Band, that restriction is really, really great, and I really like that flexibility, the immediacy. So yeah, I always thought Trick Choice Band Zong was underrated. Still hoping to see it get its due, and that's basically it. Yeah, there's other cool things Bronzong could do, like I'm sure it can heal block. I haven't figured out how to make that work yet, but I'm sure it can. So and yeah, it's got a great move pool. Oh yeah, people people were using Rain for a while, and obviously people were using Bronzong on those Rain teams. It's like you take a gamble, Hypnosis, and people had deluded themselves into thinking Rain was good, and then just as quickly they came to the conclusion that actually it was terrible. But yeah, the rain is easing up now, so great timing. I'm going to finish this up. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.